Hello, everyone, and welcome. It is just about 1 o'clock on Friday afternoon, and I want to get underway because I know we have a really exciting session today. I'm especially looking forward to this because I'm on my local zoning board, and I want to hear about controversies and struggles in other communities. So I'm going to lean into this one. For those of you who are just joining us, haven't been through this through my talk before. To kick things off, I'm Martin Daly. I'm the Director of Water Quality Programs from the Capital District Regional Planning Commission. As far as these webinars are concerned, I'm your MC. So I appear on each of these webinars. I have the pleasure of speakers joining us each week. I really recommend, if this is your first webinar in the series, I know we had a couple of people join up just before this one launched. We'll be coming to you every week for the next several weeks with a Friday and a Wednesday webinar. Housekeeping. Our presenters are joining obviously with their video and cameras off, but not everyone is. For those of you who are joining us, members of the audience, we do have you folks join with cameras off and muted, but we want you to engage with us. Please submit your questions, your comments, feedback into the chat and the Q&A, and I'll be sure to interject periodically, much like a radio DJ, to our presenters. They also will have some live polling through this. And so they'll walk you through how you can be interactive in that capacity. I do want to mention very briefly that we have a couple of opportunities coming up through CDRPC. One is our technical assistance program. So if you're with a community in the Capital District and you're looking at initiatives related to transportation, land use, placemaking, please check out that program. We've had a number of successful communities we've worked with over the years that have really valued this technical assistance that we provide, and our sister agency, Capital District Transportation Committee, provides in the transportation capacity. And next, we have an awards program that is open right now for Capital Region communities, where we celebrate the good work that's going on in communities. And oftentimes, I know in the planning perspective, sometimes it feels like it can be a little bit of a thankless job working through the public process and the daily battles, but we want to celebrate great projects that are making better places, protecting public health, protecting the environment, and certainly helping your community's bottom line. So I really encourage folks to look into this program. You can check it out on our website as well. Now, with all that out of the way, I just want to mention that as far as receiving credits, we use Zoom to distribute an automatic email 24 hours after the event. That email can be presented to your municipality for consideration of credit. Again, 24 hours. We can't set that any different. Zoom just wants to do it 24 hours after the event. So it is what it is. So you'll get that. For CM credits, this session has been logged and you can find it on the APA website. Okay, I think that does it for the housekeeping, and we can get right into our session. So today's session is planning, zoning, and controversial development. I'm really excited because Bergman is not only a sponsor for our program, but they're also going to be speaking with you today. John Steinmetz and Molly Gaudioso are here, and they are going to walk you through controversial development. Even the best laid plans can be faced with local opposition and controversy. For those of you who are zoning boards and planning boards, we know this all too well. It's particularly true when dealing with an unpopular development. So our session today will address best planning and zoning practices in the shadow of controversial development proposals, as well as strategies to manage the public outrage that's sometimes part of the public process. Using real-world examples from other communities, we're going to highlight lessons learned and open up the discussion to talk about your community's experience. So with that, I'll hand it over to John and Molly. Thank you so much for taking time to join us this Friday afternoon. Really looking forward to this session.
Martin, thank you very much. And I would advocate for anyone who's on this session the Friday before Memorial Day weekend should get an extra hour of training credits.
Noted.
But that's just me.
Hey, I'm hosting too, so I'm not walking out.
So Martin, thank you for having us as always. It's a pleasure. And again, we'd like this to be as interactive as possible, given the limits of technology. So we do have some live polling, and as Martin said, if there's questions during the presentation, we often will wait till the end, but we think for this one, during the presentation would be better for everyone. So don't be shy. It'd be nice to have a dialogue. If we don't get through all our material because we have a robust conversation, that's fine with us. So my name is John Steinmetz, Principal Planner with Bergman. Most of my experiences as a public sector, a planning consultant for the public sector, working for various private entities like Bergman. I have also done 6 years in the public sector for the city of Rochester. So I've got perspectives from the consulting side. I've got perspectives from the public side. And then also I was chairman of my local planning board. So, there's a lot of different stories we can share with you. We just focused in on a couple today that we think will hopefully resonate with you. And now I'll turn it over to my colleague, Molly.
Yeah, Molly Gaudioso, also obviously a planner with Bergman, and as well, I do have experience both in the public and private sector. So I've been a municipal planner. I've also served on City Planning Commission here in Rochester, and also faced my fair share of controversial development proposals while I was part of that board. So, as Jen said, we're excited to kind of get through these things, and feel free, pop in with those questions, and at the end, maybe we can all share our horror stories and success stories together. So we'll start with a quick poll, and you can do this if you have your phone in front of your smartphone. You can just put your camera up to that QR code. If you don't have a smartphone or you just prefer to do it by text, you can just text that number to 22333, and you type in my name, but just note that the last three are 040. To get into the actual polling system. So we'll give you a quick second to do that. And as you do, this will sort of live update who's here. So we just want to know kind of who our audience is, and maybe help us focus some of our conversation as we go through.
And if we were in person, and if this were a longer session, if you had technical issues, we would help you through them. But for this one, if you can't get on, just sit tight and see what people's responses are, just for the sake of time.
Yeah. So this is good. This is actually flipped from when we've previously presented this with, more of the actual planning or municipal staff as a part of the training than board members, and that's interesting. So this next question we have is just on what municipality you serve. So feel free to start to answer that question. Okay. I wondered.
I gotta say, this is so cool. This is super fun. Thanks for including this.
I wondered, somebody took it back. They're not with the village. So yeah, this is good. And again, kind of interesting, having other consultants on the session today, so we can kind of get into maybe some of those experiences that others have had with the work they do in planning and helping communities as well. So just before we kind of get in our main focus today, we'd really like to go through some actual case studies and talk a little bit about what was successful and what kind of issues came up, and how ultimately communities mitigated those with the process. But we always like to start with this just because it's a really important to understand the relationship between long-range planning, visioning, and your actual implementation tools like zoning and administrative procedures and things. So, this is ultimately kind of a breakdown of how that fits together. And the main things that we'll be talking about are our comprehensive plan today and your zoning, or whether you have land use law or other kind of development application guidance. We just want to note, and kind of the main theme of this is that a lot of this changes over time. Those things that you're looking at, number one, when you develop your comprehensive plan, is what are the current conditions of your community. And so some of your priorities or your values may have changed when you last did your comprehensive plan, which, as we'll talk, has some implications down the line for how you successfully implement them, hopefully. So, a main takeaway I would say from today is, really can't stress it enough, making sure that you as a community have a strong, consistent message between and capability between your comprehensive plan and whatever supporting tools you have for implementation. So just some examples of that, because I think sometimes it's a little difficult to see Obviously, comprehensive plan is more broad, a lot that we work with in cities or in villages, things like that. For example, talk about walkability, providing more defined community character and supporting, the type of development, character, scale, intensity of development that community would like to see. And how does that actually transfer into your zoning code? So, sometimes it's literal in some of the basics, your building and your lot use regulations, putting in specific pedestrian, bicycle, site connectivity requirements that are going to help, support that walkability. Something like looking at housing, as we talk about responding to the very, significant changes in the housing market, not only for the last 10 years, but recently as a result of COVID, that's something to see how take a look and see how your zoning code either supports that or may restrict some of the goals that you have associated with housing and residential development, for example. So taking a look, and this is sort of, we don't want to offend anyone, but kind of the easiest way that we could really break this down in taking a look at, what a community's approach either is by default or, maybe it's not intentional. I know we all, municipalities got to keep the lights on, got to dot your I's, cross your T's, things like that. But in looking at action related to planning and having the support, as I said, to support your vision as it's outlined in your plan, really took a look at these three categories. So there are communities, right, that may be inactive. They either maybe don't have a plan, they don't have a code, there's not a whole lot that's guiding them in terms of land use. And sometimes that's just because, maybe it's a very rural community that doesn't see very many development applications, so it hasn't been an issue yet. But this is, in this context, we typically see, obviously, if you're not checking in with the community in terms of visioning or, just kind of taking the temperature of conditions, there's not a lot of engagement conversation that's happening with the public. And then obviously, typically you're following more of the bare minimum in terms of your review procedures. Reactive communities, and I would say a large majority of the communities that we work with and that we see fall under this category. You might have an existing plan, existing zoning code or land use law that does provide some context, but again, it may have fallen out of date and you're not really aware of what those conflicts are or how it fails to provide you guidance until that development proposal comes through, which can delay the progress, right? I mean, say that development proposal comes in and it's something that you would like to support. If your code doesn't, and we'll get into this with an example, if your code doesn't support that, then you really are kind of stuck in either delaying that application by trying to fix your code or alternatively missing out on the opportunity to have it, approved the way that you like it. And again, being reactive, there's a lot that comes out, the public can get very vocal with some of these controversial issues, and you're left sort of in a defensive position rather than offensive when you're talking about future development opportunities. Whereas proactive communities, and this obviously, is what we will be promoting today, is the idea of a community that really has a plan, or a land use law. And, that doesn't have to be, for some of those smaller communities, it doesn't have to be that 100-page full, complete assessment down to the nitty-gritty of the community. It can be something that's, a little bit more general, but it gives you something to take a look at when something comes in the door down the line. And then making sure you're going back and you're reviewing that on a regular basis. So you are better positioned to address those proposals and potential controversy as it comes up. And this regular process by reaching out to the community as a part of your comprehensive planning or visioning efforts over time, taking a look at your zoning codes, helps to foster more confidence by the public and support by the public, because arguably you are hopefully aligning then your land use regulations with what the results of your comprehensive plan are.
So looking at purpose of plans and regulations, regardless of the intent to restrict or support development, they're necessary to support local decision making. So one of the things that we will often gauge is community values, whether we're updating a plan or a code, to say, look, are you more pro development, whatever that means. I know that's kind of a general description, but for today it'll work. Or are you a little more standoffish and you want to throttle or limit development? So you really want to make sure we understand what the leadership sees as the vision of the community, and then implement that through plan and code, and ultimately administration of the code. And it's important that whatever your mindset is, that it connects the code to any regulation, whether it be a full-blown zoning code or land use law, like Molly mentioned, sign ordinance, whatever the case may be. Because in absence of a well-considered plan, all land use decisions based upon it may be subject to a legal challenge. So when we have a longer training session, we'll often dive into what does well-considered mean. We'll leave that alone for today, but you really want to make sure that your plan and code, whatever they are, like I said, land use law, subdivision section, zoning code, align to each other. And, Molly had an intern in the office, and he did some digging. And, we just thought that you might be interested that in the CDRPC region, of the 62 municipal plans that we found, about a third are more than 10 years old. So it doesn't mean they're not well considered. They might have been well considered 10 plus years ago. But if you were to be taking the core, a more current plan will obviously help you much more in your legal defense of your position than an older or potentially outdated plan might.
And the other issue too, just to bring up about that, I mean, as we just talked about, a lot of controversial development plans that development applications that we see are tied to residential development, and there has been so much that has changed in the housing market and trends for residential development over the years. So that plan is being 10 plus years old is very unlikely to give you really any clear guidance to address today's climate. So to that end, we also just wanted to check in with you. Maybe we have the A team all on the call today.
The overachievers.
The overachievers. I would guess yes, because you are here learning and hoping to get more out of this. Yeah, this is good.
Gold star right there.
I'd be interested to hear, for those of you who have updated your zoning or your land use regulations, if that was a comprehensive or a full zoning law update, or something that was kind of piecemeal, right? Because there occasionally that issue comes up, and maybe that results in just an edit to a district or some development standards. And we have seen that while that's really important, there can be some disconnect between the rest of the regulations as you are updating the code moving forward.
Molly, I can actually answer that for the city of Albany. We had baked into when we did our zoning code, it was a complete overhaul. It was the first overhaul we had done since 1967. So a huge overhaul to our zoning code. And we baked into that process a schedule for revisiting the new code and seeing what was working, what still needed to be fine-tuned, and then some areas that we didn't get to in the original process because we didn't want to get into analysis paralysis. Now,
Sure.
We were supposed to come back like 6 months after we had passed the code to do that. Be it as it may, we came back, I think, a year and a half later. But we knew from when we passed the new zoning code that there would need to be some truing up from things like signs and fences, and not really related to the use table, but when it came to the site layout and site plans. One thing we did do when we got into the new code was the city had responded to a growing urgency and need for regulation of dispensaries. So we knew that the change in legislation as it related to marijuana would have an impact on our code, and we anticipated that in our municipality and started to tune that up. So that's one area we focused on.
Yeah.
And Wayne, that's not uncommon at all. I mean, when I was staff for the city of Rochester, we had done a complete overhaul in 2005. And right away, it wasn't that the consultant that helped us wasn't good. That's not the case at all. But signage, for example, we just didn't have enough time and energy. And we said, we can do signage later better.
Yep.
It was better than it was when we updated the code, but it still needed work. So that, that's pretty normal to, get what you can get done as best you can when you can, and then, live to fight another day in a different section of the code.
Yeah, we were pretty hung up on signs. It was kind of funny. The smallest elements of the components of the plan wound up being the biggest sticking points, but.
Yeah. We worked on a zoning code update actually that almost went down in flames because of commercial and RV parking. There were a whole host of other really important, great things that were helping that community. But ultimately that was the thing that really just lit the fire for the community. And so it was interesting. We were able to, maybe if we have time to end, we can talk a little bit about that too. But so kind of wrapping up, as I said, not a shock. We're here to advocate for the proactive approach as being the best practice. We do recommend that communities go through some kind of review. It doesn't mean you're going to end up having to revise it, but some kind of review of your plan and result code, or, again, whatever land use regulations you might have that support that every 5 years. If only just to be taking a look at the changing trends that are happening and maybe some of the newer issues that have come up in your community. It puts you in a position to be able to adapt to those better, can give you a broader, context for decision making on some of those issues. It also helps to take the planning process and the visioning process a step back. So it's not just about that one person or that one property. You start to look again at the broader community, and it's that vision, that context, how the relationship between your central business district, can balance investment in some of your other commercial areas, or protect residential areas, things like that. And as I said before, it does increase your public awareness and engagement with planning and zoning efforts. And just this is, kind of a mantra for me at this point, but I still see a lot of communities aren't aware of this. If you do have a comprehensive plan and when you do update it, you do have to, you very much should and do have to, by New York State law, make sure that your land use regulations align with that. And I think, as was said, it can be difficult. These are long processes. There's a lot to consider. That's why we're big advocates of doing both at the same time, which we'll talk about a little bit. But that's something that applies across the board, towns, villages, and cities.
So we got a question before folks go to the poll. Do you believe using tools like the planned use districts are more appropriate or less appropriate than doing a land use code update?
So it really depends, right? Because the idea, and obviously you get your thoughts too, but I see a lot of planned unit development districts that ultimately still don't provide much guidance, right? The idea is we're potentially allowing for something that isn't otherwise permitted under the zoning code. But if you don't have any context for what that means, you might be opening the door for something that you don't want whatsoever. And you may not have the teeth, right? Like, it's a good tool to, when that something comes in that you really like and you want to support. It could be a bad tool depending on how it's structured, if it's something you really want to push back against. So, it depends on how your regulations fall through. In that, I would say the other piece that we see a lot is it's a very unclear process. Technically, those are typically include subdivision, site plan review, and rezoning procedures all in one. So it can be very difficult to navigate that, but absolutely, it's a great tool and something that a lot of communities should at least have on the books, while still relying and referencing and giving you the context of your plan, your planning efforts and things like that.
Yeah, and I agree with Molly. The one thing I would add is, but you've got to make sure that they're used in a consistent way with your vision. Mm-hmm. So we've also seen communities essentially make them glorified spot zoning. Mm-hmm. So even though they're larger, it's always funny. I always ask attorneys, how many acres does it need to become when it's not a spot zone? Because if it's a 10-acre parcel or a 20-acre site, to me, I think that might not be a spot zone, but that's a different discussion. But the idea is, a lot of communities spend a lot of time talking about their future land use pattern, and then they codify that. And then all of a sudden they got this wild card of this plan development option. And the developer will say, hey, I want to use that way out in this rural area that your comp plan doesn't say should be developed. So you've got to be able to use it wisely. But I do think it's an incredibly valuable tool.
Thanks.
So just before we kind of get into some of these case studies, we wanted to hear a little bit from you on what you think makes a project controversial. So lack of communication engagement, unclear code. Oops. These are definitely things that we see with a lot of communities.
Is there more?
I think, yeah, it just takes a little second.
You know what I'm finding interesting so far is none of them are like specific issues or topics.
Yeah.
It's process. It's administration.
Yeah. And
Molly and I always guess like how many people are going to be on this train.
Fear of change.
We always do guesswork, and for this one, I was thinking people were going to say noise or traffic or something like that. This is not what I expected. This is interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. The fear of change piece, or kind of being resistant. This is the way it's been. Can be a really difficult thing to get over, the hurdle to get over, and to help communicate why it might be. Yeah. Yep. Community groups taking up issues. Yeah, these are interesting.
Those are great answers.
So going right into the case studies, we have some good examples of communities that have been proactive and reaped the benefits of that. I think a lot of these, just as kind of a caveat, is they're more of a reactive situation, and how a lot of communities responded to some controversial development. I think regardless, even no matter how proactive you've been, when something becomes controversial, you're ultimately in a position, you're in a defensive position. But there are sort of some best practices surrounding that, to somebody's point, and some of those comments, making things more clear, transparent, and understandable for the public in what truly is being proposed and the potential moving forward.
Sure. I'll kick this one off. So a little background, we're doing good on time.
Yeah.
So we were actually updating the town of Avon comprehensive plan, and a village trustee was on the steering committee, which I think is good practice as an aside. When you have a town and a village, it's nice to have representatives from both on the steering committee.
Or do it jointly.
Or do it jointly. So Rob, great trustee, very diligent in his duties. So as part of the town process, he came up to me after one of the committee meetings and said, John, we've got this controversial project being proposed in the village. We're not really sure how to handle it. Can you help us? So this is essentially the project. I don't remember all the particulars. I think it was 7 acres of actually built land, but the site was closer to 15 or 20. And they wanted to do a mix of apartments and townhouses. And the community then did not react to it well. The leadership of the community was intrigued. The mayor, who's a true gentleman, he said, John, this is going to be, I think the term that he used is workforce housing. He said it's going to be housing for people that are going to be, doing jobs in our community, service jobs, some other jobs that we need done that are going to be valuable members of Avon for the foreseeable future. So he saw a need, and he was supportive of the project. But the community, at the public hearings and such, there were some people that, hung their head on traffic is going to generate too much traffic, which was a joke. It was like 1 car a minute during peak hour or something. It was nothing. And all these other issues. But the reality of it came down to a lot of the resistance was the people who might live here. It's unfortunate to say, but it was true. And it wasn't assisted living financially. It wasn't financially assisted living. It was just kind of entry level workforce housing. And so the community kind of had a backlash to the project. And the village board said, we want to make sure we dot our I's and cross our T's and do this the right way. So they had us come in and actually help with the review. So we helped them manage their code. This was proposed through a planned residential development district. They called it a PRDD in this particular instance. And their code, this particular section of the code was extremely cumbersome. The objectives and the requirements were strewn throughout. I can't remember how many pages it was, probably a dozen pages. And what we ended up doing was making a spreadsheet and a table. We put their code in tabular form to be able to help the planning board say, does it meet the minimum acreage requirement? No. Does it meet this? No. And when we laid it out like that, it became a much more useful development tool. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So one of the things that we said initially was, look at this is consistent with their 2011 plan. But the community leaders, the village board said, you know what, it was consistent with 2011, but that's a little out of date now. Let's update our plan to make sure this is still consistent with, in this area of the community, having, kind of a denser mixed residential pattern in that area.
Jimmy.
Yeah, I just want to see if that's, just looking at the chat question, controversy results from competing needs between adjacent incompatible land uses, for example, residential or school development within 65 with the 65 high noise levels. Oh, these forerun. Oh yeah, airplanes. No, you're absolutely right. And what's interesting about this site, get my directions right. To the south is the high school. To the north is the commercial district. To the west is the traditional residential development pattern, walkable neighborhoods of the village. And to the east is more undeveloped farmland.
And there was a senior housing right there.
Yes. Oh yeah. There's another one, senior housing. I forgot about that one right by the school.
Yep.
So you're right. There's a very diverse set of adjacent and adjoining land uses to this project. But
a project like this, when we talk about it, I feel like we as planners are a little bit guilty, because in the early 20th century, we wanted separation of land use, the shopping can't be near the housing and the industrial can't be near the commercial. And we created these disparate land uses that create a lot of the congestion and problems we have. But now we're starting to reimagine our communities and build proximity between land uses. So it's kind of surprising when we talk about incompatible land use that anyone would ever compare housing as an incompatible land use, as if it was being proposed next to a chemical handling facility. Because housing comes in all shapes and sizes. So
especially,
surprising incompatible land use should be tied to housing.
Especially when you've got a school immediately to the south and more residential immediately to the west. I mean, we didn't do the old plan, but it was good planning.
Yeah.
It was sound policy making.
Go ahead.
Sorry.
Well, I was going to say, I think the interesting thing that came out of this is that, they did pass a moratorium to say, all right, we need to put a little bit more thinking behind all of our land use planning, but also, the idea that was sort of the impetus for it. So they did, and this is really important, they didn't just use the comp plan update process to kind of like delay things, quiet things down, and really this became, and they opened it up and embraced it as a point of conversation as part of the land use visioning component of the comprehensive plan update. So we specifically explored different options for that area, and it still remained similar to what the previous plan had suggested in terms of it being a residential land use, but it provided even more context. And what you don't see here too are some previous pages that talk about, as I mentioned before, the shift in housing markets and needs for a variety or diversity in housing options within the village. So that landed as the mixed residential character area that they then immediately thereafter followed up with a zoning district update where we revised their PRDD. Now we renamed it to PRDD, not PRRD, but PRDD. And we also established a mixed residential zoning district, which said, all right, so if somebody comes in and does exactly what we want, that was a clearer, faster path for them. If they want to do something that's maybe a little bit outside that or look at something different, we still have now a clarified plan development process and tool to be able to accommodate that. So that was, a really important outcome of the process.
And I can't remember now, this one's not a map district, right?
No, yeah, mixed
Yeah.
residential is not mapped. So that's something that's just sort of floating and an opportunity. It would ultimately require a rezoning request, but because it aligns very much with the comprehensive plan, as long as it's being proposed in an area like consistent with the comprehensive plan, that.
Yeah, and one of the points on this, not there's 3 or 4 controversial points. One of them came down to character as well.
Mhm.
You know, so one of the things we talked about, I mean, I won't criticize the developer or the architect because they have a program and a project they had in mind, but it was very suburban. You know, one of the things that Avon is consistent with is walkability. They've done walkability audits. You know, they're a very historic village. So one of the things we focused on in some of the imagery you see on this page is getting that same level of density in a more village-friendly package. So that was not the main thing, but that was one of the things we addressed as well.
All right, you belabored it now, so we got it.
Well,
We gotta pick it up.
we got Pittsburgh.
Pick it up. All right. So in the village of Pittsburgh, a similar thing, but not necessarily residential development proposal that came forward for the village along the canal in what they call the Shane Place area. It's very historic, former industrial site and area along the canal that has over time started to see new uses, you know, retail and restaurants, things like that. So once this proposal came forward, and we'll show you some other pictures with this one too, because, you know, we're inserting our own opinions into this, some of the character, we think, components started to move in the direction that I think a lot of communities would embrace. But you can see by the site plan, right, it's a lot of pavement. It's not necessarily, you know, utilizing and addressing the waterfront in the best way that it could. And they realized that there wasn't a lot of guidance specifically to that end in the waterfront area or canal area in the plan or the zoning code. So they did pass a moratorium again to update the plan and code, and they did this as a joint effort. So it was they were running concurrently with each other, the processes. Do you want to?
Yeah, one thing I'll say quickly is, and in full disclosure, so Molly and I did this plan and code update when we were not at Bergman. Bergman actually did the site plan you saw. So we're, you know, we just in full disclosure, we're critiquing our colleagues' work, so just don't tell them. But architecturally, Bergman did their homework. I mean, they hired a very talented architect who deals with older type, historic type structures, canal structures. So you can see that they did precedent imagery. They really did do their due diligence. This is a very high-end project by any standard. But the question is, was it right for Pittsburgh and did it fit in their vision?
Right. And you know, something that was identified in the previous plan was a lot of the view shed essentially along the canal, which this development, you can certainly see in the bottom right picture, had a lot more in terms of building height, scale, density than what traditionally was there along the canal front. And there were differing opinions among residents of what, you know, if that was appropriate to be able to bring in more of that density versus others who felt that it was more important to really respect the historic context of the area. So the joint process was really great because we were able to engage the public in a more detailed conversation for the vision of the canal area. And this was by doing both at the same time. I think zoning is something that's really difficult for the general public to necessarily think about the nuance of. So we were able to identify character areas and then use that as the lens to show how the zoning code itself would support that. So, you know, this is just a snapshot of parts of some boards. We literally had it in an open house that compared, all right, here's the thinking behind what we're looking at for the canal front area. And here's the district that we created that's going to make sure that the resulting investment aligns with that vision. An additional piece, and they went one step further, again, not shying away from this issue, actually opened up part of the comp plan to create a concept plan for the Shane Place area. And so this was, you know, very talented architect, planner, friend of ours, helped, and his team helped create these graphics plan architectural studio. And what this did is gave the community time, instead of under the pressure of the developer, to take a look at what they felt was most appropriate with respect to the development potential. So you can see the buildings, albeit not quite as detailed as the developer's proposal, smaller scale. You can see that green space and more engagement of the waterfront area as opposed to lining it with parking, creating of that connectivity with the canal trail and things like
Well,
that.
the big piece was keeping some of the existing buildings.
Yeah, and the big piece was keeping, yeah, you're right, some of the existing industrial buildings that were there. There were different opinions on whether or not that was feasible, but that was certainly something that was considered. And it was very blatant as something that we included as part of this concept plan to state that this plan was intended to guide and be a reference point for the consideration of future development proposals. So the idea is this is a comparison. And you can, if we put them side by side, you can see a lot of the differences in what this plan, I think, achieves more successfully versus the other plan. And then you could kind of argue nuance on character.
And just as a quick end to that story, what was kind of nice, the developer has not come back yet, but the developer did participate in our community design workshops, as did their engineer. So Bergman was there, participating, listening. So I think the process was kind of I don't like the term, but a win-win, and we'll see what they come back with.
So City of Geneva, this is one where we kind of stepped in halfway through the process, and they had done a recent update to the comprehensive plan. Actually, wasn't that a part of the other? They were on the other session the other day.
Oh, Matt Horn was the city manager of Geneva. If you were on the session earlier at the triple bottom line one, he was city manager for this comp plan update. So
they clearly had a very well-considered comprehensive planning update process, engaged the public on a lot of different aspects of what might need to change for the future character of the city and allow for needed development or desired development in this case. So the comp plan specifically recommended for the southern sort of end of the city of Geneva to transition from what is right now an agricultural residential district to a residential land use. So that, there wasn't a lot of active agricultural use there anymore. So the idea was to reduce the minimum lot requirements to allow for some denser residential development. So we, as part of that zoning update process, again, looked at a mixed residential district, responding to current housing market trends and the capability of the site to accommodate some of these things, incorporate the recommendations of the comp plan. But the neighborhood reaction specifically for those parcels immediately adjacent to and around this area was a really negative or unfavorable reaction for what was being proposed. So even though the city was doing something that, to implement and build off of the comp plan recommendation, still controversy arises as part of the process. So what they did was wanted to get out in front of a lot of things. There was a lot of media and, opinion articles and posts and things centered around this that I think inflamed the conversation a little bit more than it needed to. So the city said, all right, we need to invite these neighbors to a special public meeting and have a conversation so we can do two things. One, get out in front of the misconceptions and the misinformation, but also provide an opportunity to show some alternatives, some options where some compromise could be made, right? There's a lot of different ways to achieve denser residential development. Density is certainly a spectrum. A lot of communities define it in different ways. So we, it's not an official site plan or anything, but we started to try to visually show how, lower density development might transition from where existing developments are to something that provides for more mixed or medium density residential opportunities. So this, discussion, it was a really good discussion. It was a very lengthy discussion you can see, I don't know if it's very small, but it was over a 2-hour meeting. But, really good conversation and John and I there, one of the council members who represented that ward in the meeting as well, city staff, So it was a very good informed discussion across the board. They are currently still wrapping up this update process. So, where they ultimately land, it's not entirely decided. So some success stories. You want
Yeah,
to, Grace?
how are we doing on time?
It's 1:45.
All right, so
Yeah.
Town of Grace did their conference plan update. They just did it. We did it a couple years ago, but the prior one was, 1991, I think. Don't quote me on that, but I think I'm close. So in the interim, rather than doing a full-blown update, they did a Dewey Avenue corridor study, because Dewey Avenue, a lot of dense walkable neighborhoods adjacent to it, and then a lot of different types of commercial, big box commercial, franchise commercial, mom and pop shops. So kind of an eclectic area of the town. And as part of the comprehensive plan, they actually did a placeholder. They said, you know what, it's too complicated to deal with through the comprehensive planning process. We're going to do a designated planning study later. So they ended up doing a corridor study, and then we were being brought on to do the mixed use zoning amendment. But in between the corridor study and the zoning code, they had some development proposals, which was a challenge. So these two images you see, which I'll talk about in a second, these are what were developed under the old code. So you had your typical Dunkin' Donuts, the drive-through out facing the corner. That was the top image is an old Wegmans. So that represents old code. And then I was saying the challenge is they had this vision through the corridor study to say, let's bring the buildings up to the street. Let's make it more walkable and more comfortable for pedestrians. But they hadn't codified that yet. So the top two images you see from a McDonald's proposal in 2007, McDonald's came in after the corridor study, and the town said, hey, would you mind moving your building up to the street? And they said, we would, but that's going to create a variance situation that, one, creates uncertainty for us. Two, it's going to delay our project probably 3 months. So we're just going to go with the letter of your law of the zoning code, which at the time I think was a 100-foot setback. So that's what they did. That was a kick in the butt to the town to say, we got to update this code. So fast forward, I think the Dewey Avenue Amendment was adopted in 2011, 2012. And you see the new results. New Taco Bell, there's a Verizon store, there's some other stores that are up to the street. Side yard parking, no more front yard parking, more walkable. And as you see, 3 or 4 of these developments have come to pass. It's working. I mean, it's working remarkably well, because it's still a highly traveled corridor. It's still a very commercial corridor, but through the new code regulations that align with the corridor study from years prior, you're getting land use that reflects the vision of the community.
Oh,
Yeah, last one, I think it's the last one. One of the things Molly and I are a fan of is rewarding good projects, trying to set your zoning code up to allow for that. We don't always get that opportunity with clients, but we at least test it. So this is a great example. The city of Rochester in their new code from 05, it's not new anymore, but they had
they're updating it now.
Yeah, they had set up their site plan triggers to essentially be incentive based. So if you met the design guidelines, you got a very efficient light review process. And this is a great example. This is a 10 million plus mixed use project, first floor commercial, very high end condominiums above, and it was approved in 35 days. And the only reason it wasn't approved in less time was the seeker timeframes. So it met all the design guidelines. It was in the right space physically on the lot. Architecturally, it met all the design criteria. So it was go. We're not going to put you to any boards. We're not going to slow you down. Do your thing. So you can set your codes up to be user friendly for developers. So you try to incentivize good projects.
And I think, again, getting into the caveats that we have today, if you aren't being proactive and continually reviewing your plan specifically for the vision component, that can backfire if you make your zoning tool too flexible, right? So that's why it's really important for those to go hand in hand and to be taking a look at them either in relatively immediate consecutive order or concurrently. So, all this being said, some of these projects we talked about involved lawsuits, some of them did not. We can't guarantee, even if you are following the best of practice, that you won't see any lawsuits. We can't prevent some developers from coming forward or investors with bad proposals or, something that they might just not be willing to respond to your sort of vision, but it can better defend your decision-making process. So if you have that code and that plan that ultimately just says, that's a very suburban example, doesn't fit the character of what we're looking for, if and when that goes to court, you have a much stronger ability to defend your decision and your actions. Obviously, you can't forecast all future land use issues and opportunities, changing trends, markets, technologies, uses coming down the line. Short-term rentals is the big one. I'm not sure anybody really could have seen that coming. But by doing this and by taking a look at these tools, and like John said, giving direction in your development review procedures that can help you consider not just the immediate issue at hand, but the broader context, can help you better respond to something that's maybe doesn't fit so neatly in the regulations of your zoning code. And lastly, and as was the case, for example, like with Greece, timing is always going to be an issue. All of these things, as we mentioned, they take time. Planning, particularly, right, is something that you really want to make sure that you're giving full consideration to the context of the community, current conditions, all of those things. So, that's where the moratoriums, I think, for some communities have been helpful. It's well within your right to do that if and when you do realize there is a disconnect. You need to be, like, for example, Pittsburgh's moratorium had many whereases as it went through, but to explicitly state why it was so important for them to be going through that process and to support that.
Molly, the other thing I'll add to the moratorium thing, I'm never going to say encourage it, but I'm also going to say don't get free of it.
But don't be afraid.
Because most people think moratorium means all or nothing. That's not the case. You can custom draft your moratorium to suit your needs. So if by coincidentally, Pittsburgh and Avon took a similar approach, their moratorium said no land use changes. So you couldn't rezone a property, but if you had a commercial vacant storefront and someone had a proposal for that storefront that was consistent with the code and didn't require a zoning change or a variance, they could go in. So it didn't stop all development. Don't get the impression that moratorium puts a pause on everything. It doesn't have to be written that way.
Yeah, I think Pittsburgh did also put a moratorium on special use permit applications. Village of Watkins Glen, who we just helped update their zoning code again as an effort from there. They had a comprehensive plan, updated the comprehensive plan, the local waterfront revitalization program, and they got DRI money. And so the code update was intended to support all of that. But also a major sticking point with the community as part of it was short-term rentals for Airbnbs. Yeah. So they had a moratorium on those specifically, because there was just so much question in the air of, and being a destination community, it was a significant concern for them.
Mark, we've got a question.
Yes, we do have a question. Is there an issue in land use code if zoning variances are routinely requested and approved?
Yes, yes.
Yes,
that is the number one indicator, in my opinion, that there is something wrong.
Requested, no.
Requested, no. Approved,
but yeah, people are always going to try to push limits or
right.
find. There are unique situations. Land development is not the same everywhere. So
and it can be also too that not even that it's outdated or something like that. I mean, we've seen a lot of zoning codes. We come in and typically the case with cities and villages who, for whatever reason, in previous years adopted very suburban, large lot neighborhood zoning, and they have created over 50%, 60%, we've seen as high as 80% level of nonconformity of their existing residential neighborhoods that have smaller lot sizes. So now somebody who's just trying to come in and do a shed or an addition or something has to jump through all these hoops and get a variance, which arguably they're supposed to be very difficult to get, really creates a lot of unnecessary barriers and burdens.
And I think what that is for me is, as planners, we talk a lot about community values. And I think that screams there's a conflict, because when you see that, you might have a great comp plan or a great code that says all the right things. And so I would read that as an outsider and say, oh, I know what they value. But then when we get hired and we start to go in, let's see how many variances, let's see why you granted them. I'll say, oh, they really don't care about this as much as they care about investment at all costs or something like that. So it can really be an indicator for us of what communities actually do value. Because one of the things we ask in terms of our codes are, what are the hell no's? I mean, what are the things that you guys do not want, whether it's land use, whether it's character, development pattern, visual impacts, what are the hell no's? Let's have an honest discussion. And we appreciate honesty in all forms. Our job is not to impose our values on the community. And if community says, you know what, we don't want these things, but we won't say no to almost anything.
Yeah.
Adult use or landfill or something, sure. But, other than that, like, we'll just throw examples out. Would you say no to this? Would you say yes to this? I'm like, I'd rather have that, but we'll say yes to all these things.
That's a good example. The Village of Avon planned unit district or plan development district that we set. Specifically, we put in baseline parameters. Even if you're going to do something outside of what's permitted in the zoning code, this is what the things absolutely cannot happen. So they did have an absolute minimum lot size requirement, smaller than what was in other districts in their zoning code, but and then absolute maximum density considerations. So they, because they knew based on the conversation that there was a certain level or density of development they did not want to see.
Yeah, I will add, there's two sets of variances, right? There's use variance and there's area variances. Use variance should be very, very, like, that's the eye of the needle. The state laws and courts have laid down guidance that in order to get a use variance, it has to not be self-created, and every other potential use has to be exhausted. And those should be de facto almost impossible for an applicant to advance before a Board of Zoning Appeals. The Board of Zoning Appeals should not be making the zoning code. That is the responsibility of the elected officials in the municipality. So if you're seeing a lot of applications for use variances, then absolutely 100% the use code is not working for allowable uses in that area. And it's unfair to be having the zoning board be reviewing those cases over and over again. When it comes to area variances, yeah, there's a lot of wiggle room. And we see a lot of area variances in Albany for signs and fences. So everybody has a different belief on how high fences should be and the size of signs, and all buildings are different. Sometimes a really small, quote, small sign on a very large building doesn't make sense to an applicant. But again, those are areas where you're absolutely right. The municipality needs to be modifying the law, and the Board of Zoning Appeals should not be tasked with updating old code by a matter of setting policy through their decisions. So,
well, and the one thing that's interesting, we always see this even with our own codes, is what are the first 3 or 4 variance requests? Because I know when I worked for the city of Rochester, we had developers that would consider good developers, good investors in the community, but they were used to parking being able to be put in front, for example, because the 1975 code, that was pretty normal in not all the neighborhoods, but a lot of the neighborhoods. New codes, absolutely not. There's very few places you can do front yard parking by right in the city of Rochester. But as staff, we were really interested to see what the ZBAs were going to do, what the ZBA was going to do, because the developers, they're like, well, I've done 10 of these. I'm going to do it the same way I've always done. I'll just go for the variance. And we were all kind of waited with bated breath to say, geez, I hope they uphold this code. So, to me, it's a kind of a rule of 3. When the zoning board said no to 3 front yard parking requests by 3 different people, as a staff person, I could literally just say, look, you can spend your $500
not going to get through, yeah,
and pay your attorney and your engineers, but here's likely going to be the result, because your situation is no different than theirs. I probably shouldn't talk about this on camera, but because it's been related to me, and I can't give you a good example, but by comparison, Buffalo's green code, I've been hearing from several people, they've let some variances happen early on that are now giving them some issues with the code says this, but in practice, it's actually this. So you've got to be really careful when you do update your code to stick to it for a while enough to set precedent that's positive and helps you.
Yeah, and that could be really difficult too when, for some of these more like strip mall commercial corridors that we're trying to, transition or transform back to a more walkable, welcoming environment. There's going to be that project, that first one that comes in, and it's going to be, kind of hard, but you have to be willing and comfortable putting your foot down to start that momentum, like with Greece, right? The next couple that came in under the new district really had to hold to that to make sure. And now over time, you've seen some positive change.
Well, thanks. I think we're able to get to questions as they came in, and so I'm not seeing any questions at the end. That may also be because people know Memorial Day weekend is knocking on the door.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate your sharing your time with us this Friday. I also really appreciate the sponsorship of our webinar series. We couldn't do it without speakers and sponsors, and you guys are wearing both hats. So I really do appreciate that. You had your screen up one more for how to contact you. I don't know if you want to throw that up while I'm wrapping up. That way people have your information. We will archive this on the Eventbrite page, the same page you used to sign up. Awesome, thank you. The same page you used to sign up for the webinars and see our webinar offerings. So please check that out for a video archive of this presentation in case you missed something. Dial back into that. I do want to give a plug for our next program. That is the Renewable Energy Projects Best Practices for Municipal Leaders. We'll be talking about siting and pilots and zoning and comp planning and energy planning. So there's going to be a lot in there, and that one is going to be presented by speaker sponsor, the MRB Group. So thank you very much to John and Molly for joining us this afternoon. Hope everybody has a safe and happy Memorial Day weekend. As I'm saying that, there are sirens going by. So again, thank you.
Yeah, I thought that was awesome.
I hope money starts falling from the sky. So thank you very much. And we will we'll see folks next Wednesday at 1 o'clock to continue our discussion.
Yeah, thanks,
Bye,
everyone.
guys.